The bitter January wind cut through Dahlia Mitchell's threadbare shawl like it wasn't even there as she huddled on the church steps, her body racked with violent shivers. 2 weeks a widow, with no money, no family, and nowhere to go in this God-forsaken Montana town of Pinecrest. The church bells above her tolled 4 times, each chime a mocking reminder that soon darkness would fall, and with it, temperatures that could claim her life by morning. The funeral for Thomas had been simple, attended by strangers who'd known her husband only as the quiet shopkeeper who'd arrived in town 6 months ago. Their sympathetic glances had dried up along with their charity after the first week. Now, on this cruel afternoon in 1875, Dahlia wondered if this church step would be where they'd find her body come dawn. "Madam, you look like you could use this more than me." The deep voice startled her from her misery. Dahlia looked up through tears she hadn't realized were freezing on her cheeks. A tall figure stood before her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders broad beneath a heavy sheepskin coat. He was extending a steaming tin cup toward her. "It's just coffee, but it's hot," he said, his voice gentler than his weathered appearance suggested. Dahlia's pride wanted to refuse, but her frozen fingers betrayed her, reaching for the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking from disuse. He nodded, then glanced at the church door, locked tight against the cold. "Pastor Willard's gone to the Hendersons. Their youngest has the fever." His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, assessed her critically. "You been sitting here long?" "A few hours," she admitted, sipping the bitter coffee. The heat bloomed in her chest, a momentary respite. "You're the shopkeeper's widow." It wasn't a question. Dahlia nodded, looking down. "They sold the shop to cover his debts." The words tasted like ash. Thomas had left her with nothing but a mountain of unpaid loans and unanswered questions. The man was quiet for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Samuel Wade, I run cattle north of town." Hesitantly, she placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. "Dahlia Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but you'll freeze to death if you stay here." His gaze was direct, unflinching. "I've got a wagon. I can take you to Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house. She might have work for you." Suspicion flared through the fog of her despair. Dahlia had learned quickly that offers from men often came with unspoken expectations. "Why would you help me?" Samuel Wade's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those blue eyes. "Because 10 years ago I was sitting on church steps in Denver, freezing and starving after the war took everything. Someone offered me their hand." He kept his outstretched to her. "Sometimes that's all a person needs to start again." Dahlia stared at his hand, rough and strong. Death waited on these steps. Whatever waited beyond his outstretched fingers couldn't be worse. She placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. "I have nothing to repay your kindness," she said softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then pass it on to someone else someday." Neither could have known in that moment how their lives had just irrevocably changed, or that years later they would look back on this bitter January day as the beginning of everything. Samuel Wade's wagon was sturdy but simple, the wooden bench hard beneath Dahlia as they rolled through Pinecrest's main street. She clutched her small bundle of possessions, a change of clothes, Thomas's pocket watch that somehow the creditors had missed, and a worn photograph of her parents, both long dead. "How long were you married?" Samuel asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. 3 years, Dahlia replied. "We came west from Pennsylvania after my parents died. Thomas said there were opportunities here." She laughed bitterly. "There were certainly opportunities for debt." Samuel nodded, saying nothing for a long moment. "My condolences for your loss, Mrs. Mitchell." "Thank you." The words felt hollow. The truth that her marriage had been crumbling long before Thomas's heart had given out was not something she could share with a stranger. They pulled up before a 2-story clapboard house at the edge of town. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows. Compared to the church steps, it looked like paradise. "Mrs. Blackwood runs a tight house, but she's fair," Samuel said, helping Dahlia down from the wagon. She lost her husband at Gettysburg and came west after. She understands hard times. Before they reached the door, it swung open to reveal a stout woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her shrewd eyes assessed Dahlia immediately. Samuel weighed, "What have you brought to my doorstep this time?" Despite her stern tone, there was a warmth in her voice that suggested this wasn't the first stray the cowboy had delivered. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is Mrs. Mitchell. She's newly widowed and needs honest work and a roof." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Thomas Mitchell's widow." "I heard about your situation." She looked Dahlia up and down critically. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam," Dahlia replied, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "And so, I kept the books for my husband's shop as well." Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "I need help in the kitchen and with the rooms." "I can offer room and board plus $2 a week." She paused. "It's not much, but it's honest work." It was a lifeline. "I'd be grateful for the opportunity." Mrs. Blackwood stepped aside. "Come in then before you catch your death. There's stew on the stove." Dahlia turned to Samuel, who remained by his wagon. "Thank you, Mr. Wade. I won't forget your kindness." He touched the brim of his hat. "Get some rest, Mrs. Mitchell. Things have a way of looking brighter after a hot meal and sleep." As he climbed back into his wagon, Dahlia felt a strange reluctance to see him go. He was a stranger, yet in the space of an hour, he'd shown her more genuine compassion than she'd experienced in months. "Mr. Wade visits town every second Saturday for supplies, Mrs. Blackwood said, observing Dahlia's gaze following the departing wagon. "Keeps to himself mostly. Good man, though, one of the few." She ushered Dahlia inside. "Now come, let's get some food in you." The boarding house was simple but clean, with 6 guest rooms upstairs and Mrs. Blackwood's quarters and common areas downstairs. That first night, Dahlia slept in a small room off the kitchen, falling into an exhausted sleep on a narrow cot that felt like luxury after weeks of uncertainty. Dawn came with the clatter of pots and the aroma of coffee. Dahlia rose quickly, determined to earn her keep. She found Mrs. Blackwood already at work in the kitchen. "Good morning," Dahlia said, tying an apron around her waist. "How can I help?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded approvingly at her promptness. "Breakfast needs serving." "We have 4 boarders at present, all men working on the new railroad spur. They eat like wolves." Over the following days, Dahlia fell into the rhythm of the boarding house. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast, spent mornings cleaning rooms and washing linens, and afternoons baking or mending. The work was hard but straightforward, and each night she fell into bed pleasantly exhausted rather than desperate and afraid. The boarders were respectful enough, though Dahlia felt their eyes following her as she served meals or swept the common room. Mrs. Blackwood had made it clear to them that Dahlia was under her protection, which seemed sufficient to prevent any unwanted advances. "You're good with numbers, Mrs. Blackwood observed one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, Dahlia helping to balance the month's accounts. "Better educated than most who pass through here." "My father was a schoolteacher," Dahlia explained. "He insisted I learn more than just household arts, Mrs. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Might be useful. The mercantile's looking for help since Judith Watson's expecting again." The mention of the mercantile sent a pang through Dahlia. That's where Thomas had worked briefly before attempting to open his own competing shop, a disastrous decision that had plunged them into debt. "I'll think about it," Dahlia said noncommittally. In truth, she was hesitant to show her face around town too much. The pitying glances of those who remembered her from before were hard to bear. 2 weeks passed, and Dahlia began to feel the tightness in her chest loosen slightly. She had a roof, food, and the beginnings of independence. Still, at night, she often found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering what would become of her. At 26, she was neither young enough to easily remarry nor old enough to be content with a life of servitude in someone else's home. Saturday morning arrived with a flurry of activity. "Market day," Mrs. Blackwood explained as she set Dahlia to baking extra pies. "The ranchers come to town for supplies. We always sell out of pies." By mid-morning, the smell of apple and peach pies filled the kitchen. Dahlia was setting them to cool on the windowsill when she heard the now familiar creak of wagon wheels outside. Looking up, she saw Samuel Wade's wagon pulling to a stop across the street at the Mercantile. He looked much as he had 2 weeks prior, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward the boarding house. For a moment, their eyes met through the window. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Dahlia felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks as she nodded in return. There was something about Samuel Wade that unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. "If you're done wool gathering, Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut through her thoughts. "Those pies need to be taken to the front porch for selling." "Yes, madam," Dahlia replied, embarrassed to be caught staring. She spent the next hour selling pies to townsfolk and visitors alike, carefully collecting money in a tin box. Several people recognized her, and while some offered awkward condolences, others whispered behind their hands. Debt and failure were difficult stains to wash away in a small town. It was nearly noon when Samuel Wade approached the porch, his arms laden with supplies from the Mercantile. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted her, his voice as she remembered deep and steady. "You're looking well, Mr. Wade," she replied, surprised by how genuinely pleased she was to see him. "I am much better, thanks to your intervention. Mrs. Blackwood has been very kind," he nodded, looking pleased. "I'm glad to hear it." His eyes fell on the remaining pies. "Did you make these?" "I did." She felt oddly proud of the simple accomplishment. "I'll take one then. Peach, if you have it." As she wrapped a peach pie in brown paper, Dahlia gathered her courage. "I never properly thanked you, Mr. Wade, what you did for me. I was in a very dark place that day." His blue eyes met hers, serious and direct. "No thanks needed. I recognized the look in your eyes." He handed her coins for the pie. "Sometimes all we need is someone to remind us that the darkness doesn't last forever." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted further down the street. A horse had broken free from its hitching post and was galloping wildly through town, panicking as a dog barked at its heels. People scattered to avoid being trampled. To Dahlia's horror, a small boy had frozen in fear directly in the horse's path. Without hesitation, Samuel dropped his purchases and sprinted toward the child. In one fluid motion, he scooped the boy into his arms and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the horse's hooves. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, followed by applause as Samuel stood, dusting himself off with one hand while still holding the frightened child with the other. The boy's mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she took her son. Samuel returned to the boarding house porch, looking embarrassed by the attention. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and Dahlia could see blood beginning to seep through the fabric. "You're hurt," she said, concern overriding propriety as she stepped closer to examine his injury. "It's nothing," he insisted. "Just a scrape." Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway. "Samuel Wade, you fool-headed hero, get in here and let us clean that before it festers." Her tone brooked no argument. Minutes later, Dahlia found herself in the kitchen, gently cleaning the gash on Samuel's shoulder while Mrs. Blackwood prepared a poultice. The wound wasn't deep, but was full of dirt from the street. "That was a brave thing you did," Dahlia said softly as she worked. Samuel winced slightly as she dabbed at the cut. "Instinct mostly, didn't think about it." "That makes it braver still." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Dahlia looked away first, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of being so close to a man she barely knew, her fingers on his bare skin where she'd helped him remove his shirt. "How's your ranch faring this winter?" she asked, desperate to break the strange tension. "Well enough," he replied. "The creek hasn't frozen yet, which is a blessing. Lost fewer cattle than I expected to the cold snap last week." "You run it alone." The question slipped out before she could consider how personal it was. A shadow passed over his face. I have 2 hands who help with the cattle. Good men. He paused. But yes, it's just me at the house. Mrs. Blackwood returned with the poultice, effectively ending their conversation. She applied it to Samuel's shoulder and wrapped it with clean linen. Keep it dry for 2 days, she instructed. And for heaven's sake, try not to throw yourself under any more horses. Samuel chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to fill the kitchen. Yes, madam, he glanced at Dahlia. Thank you for your nursing skills, Mrs. Mitchell. You're welcome, Mr. Wade. She helped him back into his shirt, trying to ignore the breadth of his shoulders or the way the muscles in his arms flexed as he moved. When he had gone, Mrs. Blackwood fixed Dahlia with a knowing look. That man has been alone too long, she said cryptically. Nearly 10 years since he came back from the war and started that ranch. Never seen him show interest in town affairs until recently. Dahlia busied herself cleaning up the medical supplies. He seems kind. Kind, yes, and lonely. Mrs. Blackwood paused. As are you. I'm a widow of less than a month, Dahlia protested, her cheeks warming. And before that, you were a woman in an unhappy marriage. When Dahlia looked up in surprise, Mrs. Blackwood shrugged. This town talks, child, and I have eyes. I saw you and Thomas together at church. There was no love there. Shame washed over Dahlia. He wasn't a bad man, she said softly, just disappointed in life, in me. Because you bore him no children, Dahlia nodded, the old pain surfacing. He blamed me, said I was barren. But the doctor in Pennsylvania told me before we married that Thomas was likely the one who couldn't. She trailed off, embarrassed to speak of such intimate matters. Mrs. Blackwood patted her hand. Men in their pride, they'd rather blame a woman than face their own shortcomings. She sighed. Well, you're free now, young enough to start again if you choose to. I don't know if I want to marry again, Dahlia admitted. I'd rather stand on my own feet first. A wise decision, Mrs. Blackwood agreed. Independence is not to be undervalued, she paused, though neither is companionship. The conversation left Dahlia unsettled, bringing to the surface feelings she'd buried during her marriage. Thomas had been 12 years her senior, a family friend whom she'd married more out of expectation than love. The realization that they would have no children had turned his initial affection to resentment, and the last year had been a cold coexistence rather than a marriage. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, Dahlia found herself thinking of Samuel Wade, not just his kindness, but the strength in his hands and the way his eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. It was foolish, she knew. She was in no position to entertain such thoughts, and yet sleep came with dreams of blue eyes and a deep voice offering comfort in the cold. 2 more weeks passed with no sign of Samuel Wade in town. February arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and biting winds that kept most people indoors. Dahlia had settled into her role at the boarding house, earning Mrs. Blackwood's approval and even a small raise to $3 a week. You have a good head for business, Mrs. Blackwood commented one evening as they reviewed the accounts. Better than I do, truth be told. I enjoy working with numbers, Dahlia admitted. They're straightforward, reliable. Unlike people, Mrs. Blackwood said with a knowing look. Speaking of which, Judith at the Mercantile had her baby yesterday. Mr. Peterson came by this morning to ask if you might be interested in taking her position temporarily. Dahlia hesitated. Working at the Mercantile would mean better pay but also more visibility in town. What did you tell him? That I'd ask you, of course. Mrs. Blackwood set down her pencil. It would be $4 a week and you could keep your room here. The work's not difficult, just keeping inventory and helping customers. It was a generous offer, one that would allow Dahlia to begin saving money of her own. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. I'll speak with Mr. Peterson tomorrow. Good, Mrs. Blackwood smiled. Now there's something else we should discuss. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a letter. This came for you today. Dahlia stared at the envelope in confusion. For me, but no one knows I'm here. It's from a law office in Helena. Mrs. Blackwood explained, handing it over. With trembling fingers, Dahlia broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As she read, her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "What is it, child? Not more of your husband's debts, I hope." Dahlia shook her head slowly. "No, it's about my uncle, Harold Winters. I barely knew him. He was my mother's brother who went west when I was a child. Apparently he died last month in Helena." She looked up, stunned. "He left me his property. 5 acres and a small house just outside of Pinecrest." Mrs. Blackwood's eyebrows shot up. "Harold Winters was your uncle, the old prospector. You knew him. Of him, mostly. Kept to himself up in that cabin of his. Would come to town for supplies now and then. Never knew he had family." Mrs. Blackwood's expression grew thoughtful. "That land of his, it's not much to look at, but it's good soil. Has a creek running through it. Cabin simple but solid." Dahlia stared at the letter in disbelief. "I didn't even know he lived near here. We lost touch years ago." "Life has a strange way of opening doors when others close," Mrs. Blackwood said softly. "What will you do?" It was a question Dahlia wasn't prepared to answer. Ownership of property was something she'd never expected, especially not now, when she'd resigned herself to years of service to rebuild her life. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never lived alone. I wouldn't know the first thing about managing land." "You could sell it," Mrs. Blackwood suggested. "Might fetch enough to set you up somewhere else if that's what you want." But even as the older woman spoke, Dahlia felt a strange reluctance to part with this unexpected inheritance. It was as if, after years of belonging to others, first her parents, then Thomas, something was finally, truly hers. "I'd like to see it first," she said finally, "before making any decisions." Mrs. Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Wise, I'll ask Jeb to drive you out there tomorrow after church. It's about 3 miles north of town." That night, Dahlia could barely sleep, her mind racing with possibilities. Property of her own, independence, a fresh start. It seemed too good to be true, and yet the letter from the lawyer was real enough. Sunday dawned clear and cold. After church services, where Dahlia endured the curious glances of townsfolk who'd clearly heard about her inheritance, Jeb Peterson, the mercantile owner's son, drove her north in his wagon. "You'll be working for my pa starting Monday?" Jeb asked as they rattled along the snow-covered road. "Yes," Dahlia replied, clutching her coat tighter against the wind, "while Mrs. Watson recovers. Pa says you're good with numbers." Jeb was a friendly young man of 20 or so with a shock of red hair and freckles. "We need that. Pa's hopeless with the books." The road wound through pine forests and across open meadows blanketed in snow. Finally, Jeb turned down a narrower track that led to a small clearing. "There it is," he said, pointing. "Old Winter's place." Dahlia's breath caught in her throat. The cabin was small but sturdily built of logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch across the front. A creek, partially frozen, bubbled nearby, and beyond it stretched open land that would be meadow in spring. A weathered barn stood to one side, and what looked like a small garden plot, now dormant under snow, lay near the cabin. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jeb looked surprised. "It's mighty simple compared to town. It's perfect." The words came unbidden, but Dahlia realized they were true. There was something about this place that called to her a sense of peace and possibility. They approached the cabin, and Jeb helped her down from the wagon. The lawyer had sent a key, which Dahlia now used to unlock the door. It swung open with a creak, revealing a single large room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and a bed built into one corner. A cast-iron stove stood near the fireplace, and shelves lined one wall, holding books, dishes, and various supplies. "Uncle Harold lived simply," Dahlia observed, running her hand along the table's smooth surface. "Most prospectors do," Jeb said. "Though he wasn't much for mining in his later years. Trapped some, grew vegetables, kept chickens and a milk cow, self-sufficient, folks said." Dahlia moved through the cabin, taking in every detail. Despite its simplicity, it was clean and well-maintained. The air was cold but not damp, suggesting the roof was sound. Through a small window, she could see the creek and the distant mountains. It would need work, she murmured, half to herself. Wood chopped, supplies laid in, I'd need to learn so much. You thinking of living here? Jeb asked, clearly surprised. Alone, it's mighty isolated for a woman. His concern was valid, but Dahlia felt a determination taking root within her. Perhaps not right away, she conceded. But eventually. Yes, I think I might. They spent another hour exploring the property, the barn with its empty stalls, the chicken coop, the root cellar dug into the hillside. By the time they departed, Dahlia's mind was made up. This would be her home. Not immediately, but someday soon, when she had saved enough and learned what she needed to manage on her own. On the return journey to town, Jeb was quiet for a while before finally speaking. You know whose land borders your uncle's to the north? Dahlia shook her head. Samuel Wade. His ranch starts just beyond your creek. He's got near 300 acres, runs about 100 head of cattle. The news startled her. Mr. Wade is my neighbor, Jeb nodded. His main house is about 2 miles from your cabin up the valley. Probably why he was in town that day Well, the day he found you at the church. His route to town passes right by your land. This new information settled strangely in Dahlia's mind. The man who had changed the course of her life was connected to her inheritance in ways she couldn't have imagined. Was it coincidence or something more? When they returned to town, Dahlia thanked Jeb for the ride and went straight to Mrs. Blackwood with her decision. I'm going to keep the property, she announced. Not to live there immediately, but to work toward it. I'll need to save money, learn skills, prepare. Mrs. Blackwood studied her thoughtfully. It won't be easy. That land needs working, and winter's a hard time to start. I know, Dahlia acknowledged, which is why I'll continue working at the mercantile and hear if you'll still have me in the evenings. By spring, perhaps I'll be ready. A slow smile spread across Mrs. Blackwood's face. You've got spine, girl, I like that. She nodded decisively. I'll help you. There's plenty I can teach you about managing on your own. Thank you, Dahlia said, relieved. There's one more thing. Did you know my land borders Samuel Wade's ranch? I suspected as much, Mrs. Blackwood replied, a twinkle in her eye. Old Harold's place is up that way. Interesting coincidence, isn't it? Very, Dahlia agreed, wondering if Samuel knew of their connection. I start at the mercantile tomorrow. Perhaps Mr. Wade will come to town soon, and I can thank him again for his help. Perhaps, Mrs. Blackwood said with a knowing smile that made Dahlia blush despite herself. The following morning, Dahlia reported to the mercantile at 7 o'clock sharp. Mr. Peterson, a balding man with a perpetually harried expression, showed her the inventory ledgers, the cash box, and the ordering system. Judith usually handles all this, he explained, gesturing to the piles of paperwork on the small desk behind the counter. I'm hopeless with numbers. I'll sort it out, Dahlia assured him, already noting several discrepancies in the most recent ledger entries. The work was engaging and suited her organized mind. By midday, she had corrected the ledgers, reorganized the stockroom, and served a dozen customers without a single mistake in making change. You're a godsend, Mr. Peterson declared when he returned from his lunch break to find the store tidier than it had been in months. Judith is wonderful, but she's not one for organization. Dahlia smiled, pleased by the praise. It felt good to be valued for her skills rather than merely tolerated as Thomas had done. The afternoon passed quickly as more customers came to shop and gossip. Several recognized her and offered belated condolences, which she accepted graciously even as she inwardly winced at their prying questions about her plans. It was nearly closing time when the bell over the door jingled, and Samuel Wade walked in, stamping snow from his boots. He stopped short when he saw Dahlia behind the counter. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, surprise evident in his voice. I didn't expect to see you here. Mr. Wade, she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than it felt. I'm helping while Mrs. Watson recovers from childbirth. How is your shoulder? Healed clean, thanks to your care. He approached the counter, removing his hat. I heard about your inheritance. Congratulations. Thank you. She busied herself straightening a display of canned goods. "I visited the property yesterday. It's lovely." "It is," he agreed. "Your uncle kept it well. He was a good neighbor, quiet, minded his own business, but always willing to lend a hand when needed." "You knew him?" Dahlia looked up in surprise. Samuel nodded. "Not well, but we helped each other now and then. My hands and I cleared a fallen tree from his road last spring. He repaid us with vegetables from his garden." A small smile touched his lips. "He made a mean corn whiskey too, though he pretended not to when the sheriff was around." Dahlia couldn't help but laugh, charmed by this glimpse of an uncle she'd never really known. "I wish I'd had the chance to know him better. He spoke of family back east sometimes," Samuel said. "Never mentioned names, but he'd get a faraway look. I think he regretted the distance." "My mother used to write to him," Dahlia said softly. "Until she died 5 years ago, I should have continued the correspondence, but Thomas." She trailed off, unwilling to speak ill of her late husband. Samuel seemed to understand what she didn't say. "Will you be living at the cabin?" he asked, changing the subject. "Eventually," she replied. "I need to save money first and learn many skills. Mrs. Blackwood has offered to teach me what she knows, but there's so much I don't understand about managing land." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I could help," he finally said. "Being neighbors and all. The creek that runs through your property feeds into my grazing lands. It would be in both our interests to maintain it properly." His offer took her by surprise. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," he assured her. "Just neighborliness. When you're ready to move out there, I could check in now and then, make sure you have what you need. My ranch hands could help with any heavy work." The sincerity in his eyes made it difficult to refuse. "Thank you, Mr. Wade. I may take you up on that offer when spring comes." He nodded, then seemed to remember his original purpose. "I came for supplies. Feed, salt, coffee, ammunition, and some canned goods." Dahlia took his list and gathered the items efficiently, trying not to notice the way his eyes followed her movements or how her pulse quickened under his gaze. When she tallied his purchases, their fingers brushed as he handed over payment, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. "Will you be in town again soon?" she asked as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "Saturday," he replied. "I always come in on the second and last Saturdays of the month." He hesitated, then added, "Though I might make an exception if there was reason to." The implication hung in the air between them, undefined but unmistakable. Dahlia felt her cheeks warm. "Safe travels back to your ranch, Mr. Wade." "Samuel," he corrected gently. "Since we're to be neighbors, perhaps we could dispense with formalities." "Samuel," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "Then you must call me Dahlia." He smiled then, a full smile that transformed his weathered face and crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good day, Dahlia." "Until Saturday." As he left, Dahlia found herself staring after him, a strange flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, perhaps had never truly felt before. It was dangerous, this feeling. She was still in mourning, still finding her footing in this new life. And yet, she couldn't deny the anticipation that rose within her at the thought of seeing him again. The week passed in a blur of work and learning. By day, Dahlia managed the mercantile with increasing confidence. Evenings were spent at the boarding house, where Mrs. Blackwood began teaching her practical skills she would need for independent living: how to preserve food, basic animal husbandry, identifying medicinal plants, even handling a rifle. "A woman alone needs to protect herself," Mrs. Blackwood insisted as she showed Dahlia how to load and clean the old Winchester repeater that had belonged to her late husband. The lessons were exhausting but exhilarating. For the first time in her life, Dahlia felt herself becoming capable rather than merely ornamental. The girl who had been raised to be a suitable wife was transforming into a woman who could stand on her own. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a slight warming in the air that hinted at the distant promise of spring. Dahlia rose early, taking extra care with her appearance before reporting to the mercantile. She told herself it was merely pride in her position, not anticipation of Samuel Wade's visit, that made her pin her hair more carefully and choose her cleanest dress. The morning brought a steady stream of customers as ranchers and townspeople alike came in for their weekly shopping. By noon, Dahlia was busy enough that she almost missed Samuel's arrival until his tall figure appeared before the counter. "Busy day," he observed, taking in the crowded store. "Very," she agreed, trying to ignore the way her heart leapt at the sight of him. He looked different today, freshly shaved, his dark hair neatly trimmed, wearing a clean shirt under his sheepskin coat. "What can I get for you today?" Before he could answer, Mr. Peterson bustled over. "Wade. Just the man I wanted to see. Got that special order you requested." He turned to Dahlia. "Would you mind fetching that crate from the back room? The one marked W?" Curious, Dahlia went to the storeroom and found the crate in question. It was heavier than she expected, and when she returned to the counter, both men moved to help her. "Careful with that," Mr. Peterson cautioned. "It's delicate." "What is it?" Dahlia couldn't help asking as Samuel took the crate from her. Samuel looked almost embarrassed. "Seeds," he explained. "Vegetable and flower seeds from back east, for spring planting." Mr. Peterson winked at Dahlia. "Wade here has the best vegetable garden in the county, though he'd never admit it. Orders special varieties every year." "A man can't live on beef alone," Samuel said with a shrug, though his ears had reddened slightly. Dahlia was charmed by this unexpected revelation. "What kinds of flowers do you grow?" "Nothing fancy. Sunflowers, mostly, some marigolds to keep pests away from the vegetables." He paused, then added more quietly, "My mother loved flowers. Always said a home needs something that serves no purpose but beauty." The simple statement revealed more about him than perhaps he intended, and Dahlia felt a warmth spread through her chest. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he agreed, a shadow of old grief passing across his face. "Lost her and my father to influenza the year before the war started." "I'm sorry," Dahlia said softly. She knew all too well the hollow space left by parents' passing. An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "I'll just wrap up the rest of your usual order, Wade." He bustled away, leaving them alone at the counter. Samuel shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I was wondering," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. "That is, I thought perhaps you might want to see your property again. I could take you out there tomorrow after church, show you a few things about the land that might be useful to know." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I would like that," Dahlia replied, trying to keep her voice even despite the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble," he assured her quickly. "I pass right by on my way home anyway." "Then yes, thank you, I'd appreciate your insights." His smile was brief but genuine. "I'll come by the boarding house after services then." The remainder of their transaction was conducted with polite efficiency, but Dahlia was acutely aware of a shift between them, something tentative and unspoken taking shape. When Samuel left with his purchases, she found herself watching the door long after he'd gone. "That man's sweet on you," Mrs. Peterson observed, appearing beside Dahlia with a knowing smile. She was a plump, cheerful woman who often brought baked goods to her husband at the store. "Never seen him take such care with his appearance before." "We're just neighbors," Dahlia protested, busying herself with reorganizing a display. "He's being kind." "Samuel Wade is a good man," Mrs. Peterson continued as if Dahlia hadn't spoken. "Keeps to himself but fair in his dealings. Helped half the county during the drought 2 summers back, providing water from his creek for cattle when other sources dried up. Never asked for payment neither." Dahlia wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to hear more about Samuel, while another part warned against nurturing what could only be a foolish infatuation. She was still officially in mourning, still finding her footing in this new life. "He lost someone in the war, you know," Mrs. Peterson added more softly. "A sweetheart, I think, though he never speaks of it. There's been no woman in his life since he settled here, far as anyone knows." This revelation gave Dahlia pause. Perhaps they were alike in more ways than she'd realized, both carrying private griefs, both rebuilding lives from ashes. The next morning, Dahlia dressed with care for church, selecting her one good dress, navy blue wool with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. Her mourning clothes were too threadbare for public scrutiny, and Mrs. Blackwood had insisted that 4 months of private grief for a marriage that had grown cold was sufficient. "God knows what's in your heart," the older woman had said pragmatically. "The rest is just for show, and showing doesn't pay the bills." Church services in Pinecrest were held in the small whitewashed building where Dahlia had been sitting just weeks earlier, destitute and desperate. The irony wasn't lost on her as she took a seat in a pew toward the back, conscious of curious glances from the congregation. News of her inheritance had spread, as had rumors about her increasing independence, not all of which were approving. A widow who chose to live alone rather than seek the protection of a new husband was an oddity in their frontier community. Samuel arrived just as the service was beginning, slipping into a seat across the aisle. He caught her eye briefly and nodded in greeting, the gesture somehow both public and intimate. Throughout Pastor Willard's sermon on perseverance through trials, Dahlia found her attention wandering to the strong profile of the rancher, wondering about the life he led in his solitary homestead and what had shaped him into the man he was. After the final hymn, Dahlia made her way outside, exchanging polite greetings with townspeople who now acknowledged her with more respect than when she'd been merely a destitute widow. She was speaking with Mrs. Peterson when Samuel approached, hat in hand. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them. "Mrs. Peterson, those were fine biscuits you sent along with my last order. Glad you enjoyed them," Mrs. Peterson beamed. "A man living alone needs some home cooking now and then." She glanced between Samuel and Dahlia with barely concealed interest. "Well, I should find my husband." "Good day to you both." When she had gone, Samuel turned to Dahlia. "Are you still interested in visiting your property today?" "Yes, very much so," she replied, ignoring the speculative glances from church members who observed their conversation. "My wagon's just there," he said, gesturing to where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 well-groomed horses. "I brought some tools that might be useful for assessing what needs repair at the cabin." The ride north out of town was pleasant despite the cold. Samuel proved to be knowledgeable about the area, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history as they traveled. Dahlia found herself relaxing in his company, drawn to his quiet confidence and obvious respect for the land around them. "Your uncle settled here about 15 years ago," Samuel told her as they turned onto the narrow track leading to the cabin. "One of the first in this valley. He could have claimed more land, but he said 5 acres was all a man needed if he worked it right." "And you?" Dahlia asked. "When did you establish your ranch?" 8 years ago, just after the war ended. I came west with nothing but nightmares and the clothes on my back." He spoke matter-of-factly without self-pity. "Worked cattle drives for 2 years, saved every penny. When this land came up for auction after the previous owner died without heirs, I took a chance. It must have been difficult starting from nothing." He nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. "The first few years were lean, lived in a tent while I built the house. Lost half my first herd to wolves in winter. But the land was good to me once I learned to listen to what it needed." There was something profound in his simple philosophy that resonated with Dahlia. Perhaps that was what drew her to this inheritance, the chance to put down roots in soil that would respond to care and attention. Unlike her marriage, which had withered despite her best efforts. They arrived at the cabin to find it as she remembered, though today smoke curled from the chimney, surprising her. "I sent one of my hands ahead to start a fire," Samuel explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "Thought you might want to spend some time inside without freezing." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. Inside, the cabin was pleasantly warm, and Dahlia noticed other changes as well. The floors had been swept, dusty shelves wiped clean, and fresh candles placed in the holders. You didn't need to do all this, she said, turning to find Samuel watching her reaction carefully. Wanted to, he replied simply. Your uncle was good to me when I was starting out. Seems right to return the favor to his kin. For the next few hours, Samuel showed her practical aspects of the property she hadn't considered during her first visit: the root cellar's condition, the state of the roof, the well that provided water, the fencing that would need repair come spring. He was thorough but never condescending, explaining things clearly without assuming her ignorance. The cabin's sound, he concluded as they stood in the main room after their inspection. Needs some chinking between the logs before next winter, and the stovepipe could use replacing, but nothing urgent. The biggest challenge will be the garden if you plan to grow food. It needs turning over and enriching after lying fallow this past year. I know nothing about gardening, Dahlia admitted. Thomas always said it was beneath a merchant's wife to dig in dirt. Samuel's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her late husband. No honest work is beneath anyone, he said firmly. And there's no better feeling than eating food you've grown with your own hands. Perhaps you could teach me, Dahlia suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. About gardening, I mean, since you have experience. The request seemed to please him. I'd be happy to, in fact. He hesitated, then continued, I was thinking. Those seeds I ordered, I got more varieties than I need. Thought maybe you might want some for your garden here. Carrots, beans, tomatoes, even some of those flowers. The offer touched her deeply. It wasn't charity, but a gesture of faith in her future here. I'd like that very much. Thank you. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Dahlia was acutely aware of his presence, tall and solid beside her, exuding a quiet strength that made her feel simultaneously protected and empowered. It was an unfamiliar feeling, this sense that he saw her as capable rather than fragile. Are you hungry? He asked suddenly. I brought some food. Nothing fancy, just bread, cheese, some dried venison. Thought we might need sustenance after all this inspecting. They shared the simple meal at the rough-hewn table, sitting across from each other on benches that Harold Winters had crafted decades earlier. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, but inside was warmth and an easy conversation that ranged from practical matters of rural living to more personal reflections. What made you decide to keep this place? Samuel asked as they finished eating. Most women in your position would have sold it, used the money to establish themselves somewhere more comfortable. Dahlia considered the question seriously. At first I thought I might sell, but when I saw it. She glanced around the simple cabin. It felt like a chance to become someone new. Or perhaps someone I was always meant to be before life took a different turn. He nodded as if he understood perfectly. The land can do that, offer a fresh start. It doesn't care who you were before, only what you're willing to give to it now. Exactly, she agreed, surprised and pleased by his insight. And truthfully, I'm tired of depending on others' goodwill. I want something that's truly mine, that I've earned through my own efforts. Independence is worth striving for, Samuel said, but there's value in community too. No one really survives out here entirely alone. Like neighbors helping each other, she suggested with a small smile. Like that, he agreed, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. The ride back to town was quieter, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. When they reached the boarding house, Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Thank you for today, Dahlia said, reluctant for their time together to end. I learned a great deal. My pleasure. He seemed equally hesitant to leave, shifting his weight slightly as if preparing to say something more. Finally, he asked, would you consider coming out to the property again next Sunday? There's a stand of maple trees on the north edge that might be good for tapping this spring. Could show you how it's done. The invitation sent a flutter through Dahlia's chest. I'd like that. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Until then. As she watched him drive away, Dahlia was aware of Mrs. Blackwood observing from the porch, her expression knowing. "Productive day?" the older woman asked innocently. "Very," Dahlia replied, unable to keep a smile from her face. "Samuel, Mr. Wade was most helpful." "I'm sure he was," Mrs. Blackwood said dryly. "Come inside before you catch your death, and you can tell me all about what Mr. Wade had to say." Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. Dahlia worked diligently at the mercantile, saved her wages, and spent evenings learning practical skills from Mrs. Blackwood. Saturdays brought Samuel to town, where his visits to the store grew longer and more frequent. Sundays after church, they would ride out to her property, where he patiently taught her about the land, how to identify useful plants, basic repairs she could manage herself, preparing for spring planting. These Sunday excursions became precious to Dahlia, not just for the practical knowledge she gained, but for the deepening connection with Samuel. In his company, she found herself laughing more freely than she had in years. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and never made her feel inadequate for what she didn't yet know. March arrived with warming temperatures and the first tentative signs of spring. The snow began to recede, revealing muddy earth eager for new growth. With each passing day, Dahlia's dream of independence on her own land seemed less impossible and more inevitable. It was on a particularly mild Sunday in mid-March when everything changed. They had spent the afternoon clearing brush from around the cabin, working side by side in companionable silence. Dahlia had removed her coat in the unexpected warmth, rolling up her sleeves as she dragged fallen branches to a pile for burning. "You're stronger than you look," Samuel observed, watching her heft a sizable limb with ease. Dahlia laughed, feeling freer than she had in years. "Mrs. Blackwood says I've put on muscle since coming to work for her, all that kneading bread and scrubbing floors." "It suits you," he said quietly. "This life, you've changed since that day on the church steps." She paused in her work, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "How so?" "You stand straighter, look people in the eye more, smile more too." He moved closer, taking the branch from her hands and adding it to the pile. "You seem unburdened." "I am," she admitted. "For the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm becoming who I was meant to be rather than who someone else wanted me to be." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Freedom will do that." They stood close, neither moving away, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Dahlia was acutely aware of his nearness, of the way the spring sunlight caught in his dark hair, of how his eyes, those startling blue eyes that had first captured her attention, were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Dahlia," he said softly, her name almost a question on his lips. Before he could continue, a crack of thunder split the air, startling them both. They looked up to find dark clouds gathering rapidly overhead. The mild day suddenly transformed as a spring storm rolled in from the mountains. "We should get inside," Samuel said, his voice rough. "These storms can turn nasty quick." They barely made it to the cabin before the skies opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Inside, they stood by the window, watching lightning illuminate the darkened landscape. "Might be a while before it passes," Samuel observed, stirring the banked fire in the hearth back to life. "Spring storms in the mountains can last hours." Dahlia nodded, suddenly conscious of their isolation and proximity in the small cabin. It was one thing to spend afternoons together under the open sky, another entirely to be confined within these walls, alone. What would people in town say if they knew? A widow, not yet 6 months past her husband's death, alone with a man in a remote cabin. Samuel seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll stay only until the worst passes," he assured her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your reputation is important." "Thank you," she said softly, touched by his consideration. "Though in truth, I find I care less for town opinions with each passing day." He smiled at that. Independence indeed. They settled by the fire, the storm raging outside creating a cocoon of intimacy within. Conversation flowed easily between them, as it always did, but Dahlia sensed an undercurrent of tension not unpleasant, but charged with possibility. "May I ask you something personal?" She ventured after a comfortable lull. "You may ask. I might not answer," he replied, but his tone was light. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned, that is, I heard you lost someone, during the war." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them, seeing a shadow cross his face. "I'm sorry, it's not my place to pry." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Just as Dahlia was about to apologize again, he spoke. "Her name was Rebecca. We grew up together in Virginia, planned to marry when I returned from the war." His voice was low, measured. "I was with the Union Army, though my state sided with the Confederacy. That choice alone cost me my family's support, but Rebecca understood why I had to make it." Dahlia listened silently, sensing he needed to tell this story at his own pace. "I was gone 4 years," he continued. "Fought at Antietam, Gettysburg, and a dozen smaller battles. Took a bullet at Cold Harbor but survived." He rubbed his leg absently, and Dahlia wondered if it still pained him. "When the war ended, I went home to find my parents' farm burned. Rebecca engaged to a Confederate officer who hadn't spent the war fighting against her people." "I'm so sorry," Dahlia whispered, understanding now the pain she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. He shrugged, though the casual gesture couldn't disguise the old hurt. "She made her choice. Can't blame her, really. I came back changed, harder, angrier, not the boy she'd promised herself to. So you came west. Nothing left for me there. Figured I'd either find a new life or die trying." He looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze directly. "For years, I thought I'd never want to risk feeling that way about anyone again. And then—" He trailed off, but his eyes held hers, the unspoken words hanging between them as clearly as if he'd shouted them. Dahlia's heart hammered in her chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration flooding through her. "Samuel," she began, not knowing what she intended to say, only that something momentous was happening between them. The crash of a falling branch outside broke the moment, making them both jump. Samuel stood abruptly, moving to the window to peer out at the storm. "Rain's letting up," he observed, his voice carefully controlled. "We should head back to town before the road becomes impassable." The return journey was quiet, the air between them thick with words unspoken. When they reached the boarding house, Samuel helped her down from the wagon with the same care as always, but his touch lingered a moment longer. "Dahlia," he said softly, "I want you to know that I respect your position, your independence. I would never presume." He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "What I mean to say is, I value our friendship. I hope nothing I said today made you uncomfortable." His concern touched her deeply. "It didn't," she assured him. "Quite the opposite." Relief flickered across his face, followed by something warmer. "Good." "That's good," he straightened, resuming his usual composed demeanor. "Same time next Sunday?" "I'll look forward to it," she replied, meaning it more than he could know. That night, Dahlia lay awake long after the boarding house had grown quiet, replaying their conversation by the fire. Samuel had all but admitted developing feelings for her, and she could no longer deny her own growing attachment to him. Yet complications remained. She was still technically in mourning. More importantly, she had set her sights on independence after years of being defined by her relationship to others. The irony wasn't lost on her that, just as she was finding herself, she was also finding herself drawn to another man, but Samuel was nothing like Thomas. Where her late husband had sought to confine and control her, Samuel seemed to delight in her growing capability and confidence. He offered help without imposing, strength without domination, companionship without demands. Could there be a way to preserve her hard-won independence while still opening her heart to the possibility of love? It was a question that followed her into uneasy dreams of storms and shelter, of hands offered and accepted. The following week brought an unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Watson, having recovered from childbirth, returned to her position at the mercantile, leaving Dahlia without regular employment. Though she had saved nearly $40 from her wages, a significant sum toward her goal of self-sufficiency, the loss of steady income was concerning. "You're welcome to stay here and continue helping me," Mrs. Blackwood offered when Dahlia explained her situation. "The spring rush will be starting soon, more travelers passing through as the weather improves. I could use the extra hands." Dahlia accepted gratefully, though the boarding house work paid less than the mercantile had. More concerning was the realization that without daily work in town, her opportunities to see Samuel outside their Sunday meetings would be limited. As if fate had heard her concerns, the very next day brought a letter addressed to her, delivered by one of Samuel's ranch hands. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a neatly written note. "Dahlia, I hope this finds you well. I understand from Mr. Peterson that your position at the mercantile has concluded. I find myself in need of assistance with my accounts and correspondence, tasks I have neglected too long while focusing on the ranch work. If you would consider taking on this role, I could offer $4 weekly for your expertise, working at the boarding house or your cabin as you prefer. The work would require only a few hours each week to start, though it may increase as spring brings more ranch business. Please send word with Miguel if this arrangement might interest you. Respectfully, Samuel weighed the offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. It was practical, respectable work that would utilize her skills, and the pay was generous for the hours required. Yet Dahlia sensed that it was also Samuel's way of maintaining their connection, of creating legitimate reasons for their continued association. "Well," Mrs. Blackwood prompted, having watched Dahlia's face as she read the letter. "What does he say?" "He's offering me work," Dahlia explained, passing her the note, "managing his accounts and correspondence." Mrs. Blackwood read it quickly, a knowing smile spreading across her face. "Very proper, very respectable, and very convenient." Dahlia felt her cheeks warm. "It's a business arrangement." "Of course it is," Mrs. Blackwood agreed, not bothering to hide her amusement. "And a sensible one. You need the income, he needs the help. That his eyes follow you like a man dying of thirst watches water is merely incidental." Mrs. Blackwood. Dahlia protested, though she couldn't suppress a smile. "Oh, child, don't play coy with me. I've seen how you look at each other." The older woman's expression softened. "And I've seen how he's helped you find your strength these past months. Not by doing for you, but by believing you could do for yourself." It was true, Dahlia realized. Samuel's steady faith in her capabilities had been as valuable as his practical assistance. "I'll accept his offer," she decided, "but I'll maintain professional boundaries." Mrs. Blackwood merely raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You do that, dear." Dahlia sent her acceptance with Miguel, suggesting that she could begin the following day if Samuel would send the necessary ledgers and papers. By noon the next day, another ranch hand arrived with a wooden box containing meticulously kept but clearly overwhelming financial records spanning the past 5 years. A note on top reads simply, "I apologize for the disorder. My talents lie elsewhere than paperwork." As for the next week, Dahlia immersed herself in organizing Samuel's accounts. It was satisfying work, bringing order to chaos, and she quickly developed a system that would make future record-keeping simpler. She found herself learning about the ranch through its papers, the size of his herds, the names of his regular buyers, the improvements he'd made to the property over the years. Their Sunday meeting took on a new dimension, beginning with business discussions before moving to their usual work around her cabin. Dahlia presented him with organized ledgers and a clear accounting of his finances, which were healthier than he'd realized. "You've been undercharging the Harrington outfit for 2 years, she informed him, showing him the discrepancy in his records, "and overpaying for feed from the mercantile." Samuel looked impressed. "You've done in a week what I've avoided for years." "I enjoy it," she admitted. "There's satisfaction in making sense of numbers." "Then I'm doubly grateful," he said, his eyes warm as they met hers, "for both your skill and your enjoyment of it." April arrived with longer days and the first wildflowers pushing through the softening earth. The creek that ran through Dahlia's property swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, its rushing voice a constant companion during her increasingly frequent visits to the cabin. With Samuel's help and guidance from Mrs. Blackwood, she had begun preparing the garden for planting, turning the soil and adding manure from Samuel's cattle to enrich it. On a particularly fine Sunday, they worked together setting fence posts around the garden plot to keep out rabbits and deer. Dahlia held each post steady while Samuel drove it into the ground with powerful strokes of a mallet. The rhythm of their work was companionable, their movements falling into natural synchronization. "I think I'm ready," Dahlia said suddenly, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Samuel paused, mallet mid-swing. "Ready to move out here to the cabin." She gestured around them at the awakening land. "Spring is here, the worst of winter is past. I've saved enough to buy supplies and some livestock, a few chickens to start, maybe a milk cow later." He lowered the mallet, studying her face. "You're sure it won't be easy, especially at first?" "I'm sure," she affirmed, surprising herself with her certainty. "I've learned so much these past months, and I won't be completely alone. You're nearby if I truly need help." A complex emotion crossed Samuel's face, pride mingled with concern, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "When would you go?" "Next week, perhaps. Mrs. Blackwood has already found a girl to replace me at the boarding house." Dahlia hesitated, then added, "I could continue working on your accounts if you still want me to." "I do," he said quickly, then seemed to catch himself. "That is, your work has been invaluable. I'd be grateful if you continued." They resumed their fence building, but something had shifted between them, a new awareness, a sense of imminent change. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they stood back to admire their completed work. "It's good," Samuel said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Should keep the critters out of your vegetables." "Our vegetables," Dahlia corrected him. "Since half the seeds are yours." He smiled at that, a full smile that transformed his weathered face and made her heart skip. "Then we'll share the harvest." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Dahlia was acutely aware of his nearness, of how his shirt clung to his shoulders damp with honest sweat, of the way the setting sun burnished his skin to gold. Samuel took a step closer, hesitantly, as if approaching a skittish colt. "Dahlia," he began, his voice lower than usual, "there's something I need to say." Her heart thundered in her chest. "Yes, these past months working beside you, watching you build this new life." He gestured at the cabin, the garden, the land around them. "You're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known." The praise warmed her from within. "Thank you, though I couldn't have done it without your help." "You could have," he contradicted gently. "Might have taken longer, but you'd have managed. That's what I admire most, your willingness to try, to learn, to face whatever comes." He took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, smell the clean scent of his skin. "I find myself thinking of you when we're apart, wondering how your day is going, if you're well, if you're happy. I look forward to our Sundays more than anything else in my week." Dahlia felt breathless, caught between hope and fear. "Samuel, please," he interrupted softly. "Let me finish. I need to say this plain so there's no misunderstanding." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Dahlia, more than I thought possible to care for anyone again. I'm not asking anything of you now, it's too soon, I know that. You're still finding your way, still grieving in some measure. But I wanted you to know my feelings before you make this move, so you can decide with all the facts before you." His honesty left her speechless. Thomas had never spoken to her so directly, so respectfully, about his feelings or intentions. Always there had been manipulation or assumption, never this straightforward declaration that left the choice entirely in her hands. "I care for you too," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I expected to, more than I thought I could after everything." Relief and joy flooded his face. "Then I'm a fortunate man indeed. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he raised his hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. Dahlia leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When she opened them again, he was watching her with such naked emotion that it stole her breath. "May I kiss you, Dahlia?" he asked, his voice rough with feeling. In answer, she raised her face to his. Their lips met softly at first, tentatively, then with growing certainty. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and she found her hands resting against the solid warmth of his chest. The kiss deepened, awakening sensations Dahlia had never experienced before, a sweetness and heat that made her dizzy with wanting. When they finally parted, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I saw you selling pies on the boarding house porch," he confessed. Dahlia laughed softly. Longer if I'm honest. Since you looked up at me from those church steps with determination in your eyes even through your tears." His expression grew serious. "I want to court you properly, Dahlia. No rushing, no pressure, just time to know each other to be sure." His consideration touched her deeply. "I'd like that." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky, arms entwined, the promise of something new and precious blooming between them like the wildflowers scattered across the meadow. The following week passed in a flurry of preparation. Dahlia gave notice to Mrs. Blackwood, who accepted her decision with a mixture of pride and motherly concern. "You'll come to town regularly," the older woman insisted. "At least for church on Sundays. I want to know you're well." "I promise," Dahlia assured her, touched by her genuine care. "And you must visit me once I'm settled." Mrs. Blackwood helped her purchase necessary supplies, cooking utensils, bedding, preserved foods to tide her over until her garden produced. Samuel contributed practical items: an axe for chopping firewood, a hunting rifle with ammunition, tools for basic repairs. The pastor's wife organized a cabin warming where women from the church donated household goods: curtains, linens, cookbooks, jars of preserves. Dahlia was overwhelmed by the community's generosity, especially from people who had barely acknowledged her existence months earlier. Perhaps it was her association with Samuel, a respected rancher, or perhaps it was simply that they respected her determination to make her own way. Whatever the reason, their support made her transition less daunting. On a bright Tuesday morning in late April, Samuel arrived with his wagon to transport Dahlia and her belongings to the cabin. Mrs. Blackwood hugged her fiercely before letting her go. "You come back if you need anything," the older woman insisted, pressing a package into Dahlia's hands. "Seed cakes, your favorite?" "Thank you," Dahlia said, blinking back unexpected tears, "for everything." The journey to the cabin was filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As they crested the final hill and the small structure came into view, nestled among budding trees with the creek sparkling nearby, Dahlia felt a surge of pride and ownership. "Welcome home," Samuel said softly, sensing her emotion. Home. The word resonated through her, filling empty spaces she hadn't realized existed. This modest cabin on 5 acres of Montana soil was more truly hers than anything in her life had ever been. They spent the day settling her belongings, Samuel making small repairs and adjustments to ensure her comfort and safety. He showed her how to operate the wood stove efficiently, how to secure the shutters against storms, how to prime the pump for the well. "I've arranged for Miguel to check on you every few days," he told her as evening approached. "Just until you're fully settled, and I'm only 2 miles north if you need anything urgent." His concern was touching rather than stifling. "Thank you. I'll be fine, but I appreciate knowing help is near if needed." As the sun began to set, Samuel reluctantly prepared to leave. "I should go," he said, though his expression suggested he'd rather stay. "Give you time to settle in on your own." Dahlia walked him to his wagon, suddenly nervous about her first night alone in the cabin. "Will I see you Sunday?" she asked. "Sooner," he promised. "I'll come by Thursday to help with planting those seeds, if that's agreeable." Very agreeable, she replied, smiling. He hesitated, then stepped closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. May I? In answer, she rose on tiptoe to press her lips to his. The kiss was brief but full of promise, a seal on the new chapter beginning for both of them. Good night, Dahlia, he murmured as he reluctantly stepped back. Good night, Samuel. She watched his wagon until it disappeared over the ridge, then turned to face her cabin, her home, with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. The first night alone would be the hardest, she knew, but each day would grow easier as she settled into the rhythms of her new life. Inside, she lit the lamps and stoked the fire in the wood stove, filling the small space with warm light. After a simple supper of bread and cheese, she settled into the chair by the fire with one of the books from her uncle's shelves, a volume on local plants and their uses. The silence around her was different from town, not the absence of sound, but a tapestry of natural noises. The creek's constant murmur, the wind in the pines, an owl's questioning call. It was a living silence, one that wrapped around her like a blanket rather than pressing upon her like a weight. As darkness fully claimed the land outside, Dahlia prepared for bed, saying her prayers with particular gratitude for the path that had led her here, from desperate widow on church steps to independent woman in her own home. And with special thanks for the man whose offered hand had been the first step on that journey. The days that followed established a new rhythm to Dahlia's life. She rose with the sun, tended to the small flock of chickens Samuel had helped her acquire, worked in her garden, kept the cabin in order, and spent time each day on Samuel's accounts and correspondence. The solitude, rather than oppressive, was peaceful, a chance to hear her own thoughts clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. Samuel visited regularly, always announcing his approach with a halloo from the road to give her proper notice. Their courtship progressed with a sweet restraint that Dahlia found both frustrating and endearing. Each visit deepened their connection through shared work, conversation, and increasingly passionate kisses that left them both breathless and wanting more. By late May, Dahlia's garden was thriving, with neat rows of vegetables pushing through the rich soil and the first flowers, marigolds and nasturtiums, adding splashes of color among the green. The cabin had transformed as well, reflecting her personality in small touches: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, wildflowers in jars on the table. On a particularly beautiful Sunday afternoon, they sat together on the porch steps after a shared meal, watching clouds drift across the Montana sky. Samuel's arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaning against him in a pose that had become natural to them both. I have something to ask you, he said after a companionable silence. Dahlia looked up, curious at the slight tension in his voice. What is it? Samuel shifted to face her more directly. I've been thinking about the future, our future if you're willing. Her heart quickened. I'm listening. You've built something remarkable here, he began, gesturing to the flourishing homestead around them. You've proven beyond any doubt that you can stand on your own 2 feet, rely on your own strength. I admire that more than I can say. He took her hands in his expression earnest. I want you to know that whatever happens between us, this place is yours. Your independence is yours. I would never ask you to give up what you've worked so hard to create. Tears pricked at Dahlia's eyes at his understanding of what mattered most to her. Thank you for that. But, he continued, his voice deepening with emotion, I find myself hoping that we might build something together as well. Something that enhances rather than diminishes what we each have created separately. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved with delicate floral patterns. I made this, he said almost shyly. Spent evenings working on it these past weeks. Opening it, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire that echoed the blue of his eyes. It was my mother's, he explained. The one thing of hers I managed to save after the war. Dahlia's breath caught as she realized what was happening. Samuel slid from the step to kneel before her, still holding her hands. Dahlia Mitchell, I love you. Your strength, your determination, your kindness, your sharp mind, everything about you. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, not to diminish your independence but to join our lives in a partnership where we face whatever comes side by side." Tears flowed freely down her cheeks now. "Oh, Samuel, you don't have to answer right away," he added quickly. "Take all the time you need to be certain. I just wanted you to know the depth of my feelings and my intentions." But Dahlia didn't need time. In her heart, she had known her answer for weeks, perhaps even months. Since that day on the church steps when a stranger had offered his hand and changed the course of her life. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite her tears. "I love you, Samuel Wade, and yes, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. He rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, breathless and laughing, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I have one more question," he said. "About our living arrangements." Dahlia tensed slightly. This was the question she had anticipated. Would she give up her beloved cabin to move to his ranch? Sensing her concern, Samuel quickly continued, "I was thinking we could split our time between both properties. Keep your cabin as it is a place for you to maintain your independence, for us to come when we want simplicity or solitude. And share my house as our main home where we can build our future together." The thoughtfulness of his suggestion, acknowledging both her need for autonomy and their desire for a shared life, touched her deeply. "That sounds perfect," she agreed, "though I have a condition of my own." "Anything," he promised immediately. "This cabin should always remain as it is a place of new beginnings. Perhaps someday it could help someone else who needs a fresh start, just as it helped me." Samuel nodded, understanding her meaning perfectly. A hand offered to someone in need passed forward. Exactly. She smiled up at him, her heart full of love for this man who had seen her at her lowest and helped her rise. Not by carrying her, but by believing she could walk on her own. They were married on a perfect June morning, with wildflowers decorating the small church where they had first met. Mrs. Blackwood wept openly as Dahlia walked down the aisle in a simple ivory gown, carrying a bouquet of flowers from her own garden. Samuel waited at the altar, his normally composed face alight with joy and wonder as he watched his bride approach. Pastor Willard spoke of partnership, of love that elevates rather than confines, of two independent spirits choosing to journey together while honoring each other's unique gifts. As Dahlia and Samuel exchanged vows, she thought of how far she had come from that desperate widow shivering on church steps just 5 months earlier. The wedding celebration continued at Samuel's ranch, now their ranch, where neighbors and townspeople gathered to share food, music, and well wishes. The house was large and comfortable, built by Samuel's own hands over the years, with plenty of room for the family they both hoped to create together. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked as they stole a quiet moment alone on the porch, watching their guests dance in the yard. "That life can change completely in the space of a single choice," Dahlia replied, leaning against his shoulder. "If you hadn't stopped that day, if I hadn't taken your offered hand." "Some things are meant to be," he said simply, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We would have found each other somehow." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps their paths were destined to cross, their broken pieces designed to fit together and create something stronger than either could have built alone. But Dahlia preferred to believe in the power of that single moment of human connection, a stranger's kindness, a desperate woman's courage to accept help, and the beautiful journey that had unfolded from that beginning. "I love you, Samuel Wade," she whispered, turning in his arms to face him. "And I love you, Dahlia Wade," he replied, the new name falling naturally from his lips. As the celebration continued around them, they stood together on the threshold of their shared future, each stronger for having found the other, each still wholly themselves while becoming something new together, like the wildflowers and garden vegetables growing side by side in Dahlia's garden, different but equally valuable, equally necessary for the fullness of life. 5 years later, Dahlia stood on the porch of their main house, watching Samuel approach from the fields with their 3-year-old son perched on his shoulders and their infant daughter cradled against his chest. The sight of them, her family, still filled her with wonder and gratitude every day. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Samuel's practical knowledge of cattle and land combined with Dahlia's head for business had expanded their operation considerably. They now employed 5 hands year-round and sold beef as far east as Chicago. Dahlia's cabin remained exactly as she had insisted, a sanctuary they visited regularly, sometimes as a family, but often just the two of them, reconnecting with the simplicity that had brought them together. And occasionally, it served its higher purpose, providing temporary shelter for those in need of a fresh start: a young widow and her child fleeing an abusive situation, an elderly man who had lost his farm to fire, a family passing through with nowhere else to go. "Mama." Her son called, waving excitedly as they approached. "Papa showed me the new calves." "Did he now?" Dahlia replied, smiling as Samuel set the boy down to run the last few yards to her. She caught him in her arms, marveling as always at how he combined features from both parents: Samuel's blue eyes, her dark hair, a spirit entirely his own. Samuel followed more slowly, careful with the sleeping infant against his chest. "She finally dozed off," he said softly as he joined them on the porch. "Fought it like a wildcat, stubborn as her mother." "Strong-willed," Dahlia corrected with a smile, reaching to stroke her daughter's downy head, like both her parents. Their son tugged at her skirt, eager for attention. "Can we go see Aunt Alina tomorrow? She promised to show me the new puppies." "We'll see," Dahlia answered, exchanging an amused glance with Samuel. Alina was Mrs. Blackwood, who had long since stopped correcting the children's use of the honorary aunt title, delighting in her role as surrogate grandmother to the Wade children. As the afternoon light gilded the landscape around them, Dahlia felt the familiar surge of contentment that had become the foundation of her days. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hardships, disagreements, moments of doubt or fear. But she faced them now from a position of strength, with a partner who valued her independence as much as their union. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, she and Samuel sat together on the porch swing, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. His arm around her shoulders was a welcome weight, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow of his neck as it had since their earliest days together. "I was thinking," Samuel said after a comfortable silence, "about the church steps." Dahlia looked up, surprised. They rarely spoke directly of their first meeting anymore, not because it was painful, but because it had been so thoroughly incorporated into the story of their lives that it needed no separate acknowledgement. "What about them?" she asked. "Just that I almost didn't stop that day." His voice was thoughtful, his fingers absently stroking her arm. "I was in a hurry, had cattle business to finish before dark. I saw you sitting there but told myself someone else would help." The revelation stunned her. "What made you change your mind?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, remembering. "Something in your posture, I think. You weren't begging or calling out for help. You were just enduring. It reminded me of myself those years after the war when I was too proud to ask for what I needed." Dahlia nestled closer to him, overwhelmed by how easily their story might have been different. "I'm glad you stopped." "So am I." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Best decision I ever made, offering my hand to the widow shivering on church steps." "Second best," she corrected with a smile. "Best was asking me to marry you." Samuel laughed, the sound still her favorite in the world. "You're right, as usual." His expression grew more serious, tender. "Thank you for building this life with me, Dahlia, for our children, our home, our love. I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again." "Nor I," she admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought perhaps my chance for joy had passed. That survival was the most I could hope for. And now," she smiled up at him, pouring all her love into her gaze. "Now I know that life can begin again at the most unexpected moments." That sometimes all it takes is the courage to accept an offered hand, and everything can change. Samuel lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made her heart race and her soul sing. When they parted, breathless and smiling, the stars seemed to shine more brightly overhead, witnesses to a love that had begun in desperate circumstances, but had blossomed into something neither could have imagined on that cold January day. Together they sat in the gathering darkness, the rancher and his wife, watching over the life they had built from nothing but hope and determination. The challenges they had faced, the joy they had found, the family they had created, all of it stemming from that singular moment of human connection. When a widow shivering on church steps had accepted a cowboy's offered hand, and both their lives had been forever changed.